Welcome to Video 4, British Rule and External Developments. In the last video, we looked at how Singapore became a British trading post in 1809 and why it grew so quickly in those first few years. In this video, we are going to zoom out further and look at what happened over the longer period of British rule, how the administration changed, how the port grew and ran into problems, how migration shaped the people of Singapore, and how events happening on the other side of the world, the Suez Canal, the demand for tin and rubber, and the Great Depression hit Singapore hard. Because Singapore was already connected to the world, what happened in the world happened to Singapore too. This video is for Singapore Secondary 1, students studying British rule and external developments. If you have the external developments chart, the port growth flow chart, or the WA-style practice questions in your resource pack, this is the video that covers everything those materials are testing you on. By the end, you will be able to explain how British rule changed Singapore, describe how trade and port facilities grew over time, explain how migration made Singapore more diverse, and use 3 specific external developments: the Suez Canal, tin and rubber demand, and the Great Depression, to explain what happened to Singapore's economy. Let's begin. Here is what we will cover. We start with British rule and administration at 1:30, then trade growth and port facilities at 4, people and society at 7, external developments at 9:30, historical meaning at 12:30, and practice and recap at 13:30. Use these timestamps to revisit any section before a test. Now let's get into it. Let's start at the beginning, or rather, after the beginning. After Singapore was established as a trading post in 1890, the British gradually formalized and strengthened their rule over the island. The first big step came in 1826, when Singapore was grouped together with Penang and Malacca to form the Straits Settlements, a single British administrative unit that governed all 3 ports together. This made the administration more organized and gave the British a stronger coordinated presence in the region. Then, in 1867, the Straits Settlements became a Crown colony, which meant it was placed under the direct control of the British government in London rather than being managed by the East India Company. A Crown colony is a colony ruled directly by the British government. Each of these steps made British rule in Singapore more formal, more structured, and more powerful. One of the most important things British rule brought to Singapore was law and order. Law and order means the rules and systems that keep society safe and organized. The British established a police force, courts, and a legal system. They created administrative structures to manage a rapidly growing population. And they introduced regulations for trade and business, clear rules about how commerce was to be conducted. Now, why does this matter for our story about trade? Because merchants are practical people. They will not bring their goods, their ships, or their money to a place that feels unsafe or unpredictable. If a port has no reliable legal system, a merchant has no way to resolve a dispute if something goes wrong. If there is no police force, goods might be stolen. Law and order made Singapore a place where merchants could do business with confidence, and that confidence encouraged more trade. British rule also brought public services to Singapore, though it is important to be honest about the limitations here. Public services are the things a government provides for the community: healthcare, education, roads, and so on. The British did introduce some hospitals and clinics. They introduced some schools, mainly teaching in English. They built roads and some basic infrastructure to support the growing city. But these services were still quite limited. Not everyone had access to a school or a doctor. The improvements in sanitation, cleanliness, and public health were real but uneven. Many parts of Singapore, especially the areas where poor workers lived, remained very difficult places. So the honest picture of British public services is better than before, but far from enough. Some progress with significant gaps. When you put law and order and public services together, you can see how British administration created conditions that helped trade grow. Better law and order meant safer conditions for merchants, which brought more merchants. Courts and a legal system meant disputes could be settled fairly, which gave investors more confidence to put money into Singapore. Infrastructure like roads and port facilities meant goods could move more easily. And stable government meant that merchants and investors from across Asia and Europe trusted Singapore as a reliable place to do business. This is what the port growth flowchart in your resources is showing. British rule, Jai better administration. British better administrations. Bridge more trade. Bridge more trade. Bridge one. Buon dridge. We talked about the free port policy in video 3, but it is worth revisiting here because it did not just help Singapore in the early years. It kept driving growth throughout the 1800s and into the 1900s. The free port meant that any trader from any country could come and trade with few or no taxes. As Singapore grew bigger and more established, this advantage compounded. A bigger port attracts more traders. More traders means bigger markets. Bigger markets give even more traders a reason to come. And all the while, competing ports that charged higher taxes were losing business to Singapore. The free port policy, combined with good law and order and a strategically excellent location, created something very powerful, a trading destination that was simply difficult to beat. Once the cycle of growth started, it fed itself. But rapid growth created a problem. In the early decades, most of Singapore's trade was concentrated along the Singapore River. You can imagine the scene: bumboats carrying goods along the river, warehouses, called godowns, lining both banks, merchants and laborers working the waterfront. It was busy, productive, and central to Singapore's commercial life. The problem was that trade grew faster than the river could handle. The Singapore River is not very wide, and it is not very deep. As the volume of trade increased, the river became congested, overcrowded. There were too many boats trying to use too little space. Loading and unloading slowed down. And here is the bigger issue. The new generation of larger ships coming from Europe simply could not fit in the Singapore River. The shallow river that had served early Singapore well was becoming a bottleneck. The British responded by developing New Harbour, which was later renamed Keppel Harbour. New Harbour was a deep-water harbour on the south side of Singapore Island, separate from the Singapore River. It had much deeper water, which meant larger ships could dock there. It had more space for multiple vessels to use at the same time, and it was developed with better loading and unloading facilities. The infrastructure needed to handle the scale of trade Singapore was now processing. The development of New Harbour was a significant piece of infrastructure investment. It allowed Singapore's port to scale up to meet the demands of modern global trade. The congestion problem on the Singapore River was not solved overnight, but New Harbour gave Singapore the capacity it needed to keep growing as a major port. Let's pause and check what you have learned so far. 3 questions. First, give 2 ways British rule helped Singapore grow as a trading port. Second, why did the Singapore River become congested, and how did the British solve this problem? Third, look at the port growth flowchart in your resources. It shows British rule leading to better administration, which leads to more trade, which leads to port growth. Pick one link in that chain and explain it in your own words. Pause the video now, think through all 3, and write down your answers. Then unpause to check. Here are the model answers. 2 ways British rule helped trade. First, better law and order made conditions safer for merchants and ships. People trusted Singapore as a place to do business. Second, the free port policy continued to attract traders with low or no taxes. Other valid answers include infrastructure development and stable government. For the Singapore River, trade grew so fast that the river became too crowded, too many boats in too small a space, and larger ships could not even enter the shallow river. The British solved this by developing New Harbour, which had deeper water, more space, and better facilities for handling larger vessels. For the chain link, one example would be better law and order created safer conditions, which meant merchants felt confident bringing their goods to Singapore, which increased the amount of trade flowing through the port. As Singapore's port economy grew, more and more people came to live and work there. This is migration, the movement of people from one place to another. And the result was diversity, the presence of many different groups in one society. By the mid-1800s, Singapore was already home to a remarkable range of communities. Chinese migrants came from Fujian, Guangdong, and other southern Chinese provinces. Many worked as laborers, merchants, shopkeepers, and craftsmen. Indian workers and traders came from the subcontinent, many serving as laborers, soldiers, and merchants. The Malay community, already present before 1819, continued to live and work in Singapore as sailors, fishermen, and traders. And a smaller European community of company managers, officials, and professionals also settled in Singapore. Each community established its own neighborhoods, temples, mosques, churches, and social organizations. Singapore was not one community. It was many communities living in the same port city. But rapid growth also brought serious problems. When people arrive faster than housing can be built, overcrowding follows. And that is exactly what happened in Singapore's early decades. Many workers lived in extremely crowded conditions, multiple families sharing small shophouses with little space, poor ventilation, and limited access to clean water. Sanitation was a major issue. Sanitation means cleanliness and public health conditions. Without proper sewage systems or reliable clean water in many areas, waste accumulated, rubbish piled up. In dense, crowded conditions, disease spreads much more easily. Cholera, dysentery, and other diseases were recurring problems in Singapore's congested neighborhoods. The British did introduce some improvements in sanitation over time, but the scale of the problem, driven by how fast the population was growing, meant that improvements could not keep up. This is a pattern you see in rapidly growing port cities around the world. Fast growth brings prosperity and problems at the same time. Now let's talk about the external developments, the things that happened outside Singapore that shaped what happened here. The first and perhaps most dramatic was the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869. The Suez Canal is a waterway cut through Egypt, connecting the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea. Before it opened, ships sailing from Europe to Asia had to take an enormously long route, all the way down the Atlantic Ocean, around the southern tip of Africa, and then north and east across the Indian Ocean. It took months. After the Suez Canal opened, ships could cut through Egypt instead, saving an enormous amount of time and fuel. The journey from Europe to Asia became much shorter and much more commercially viable, and the effect on Singapore was direct and immediate, with more ships now making the Europe to Asia journey because it was faster and cheaper, and with Singapore sitting right on that route, more ships stopped at Singapore. More stops meant more trade. The Suez Canal made Singapore more important overnight. The second external development was the rising demand for tin and rubber from Malaya. As the British expanded their administration in the Malay Peninsula, they opened up access to two natural resources that the world wanted in large quantities. The first was tin. Tin was used in food canning. The tin can that preserved food was becoming standard across the developed world. And in a wide range of industrial manufacturing, Malaya had substantial tin deposits, particularly in the Perak and Selangor regions, and tin mining expanded rapidly. The second was rubber. As the automobile industry grew in Europe and America in the early 1900s, demand for rubber tires exploded. Malaya's tropical climate was ideal for rubber trees, and rubber plantations spread across the peninsula. Both of these resources came through Singapore. Raw tin and rubber arrived in Singapore from Malaya. Singapore processed, packaged, and exported them to global markets. Singapore became the regional hub for both commodities, which added a whole new dimension to its economic importance. The third external development was very different from the first two, not a boost, but a shock. The Great Depression began in 1929 when the United States banking system collapsed, triggering a catastrophic fall in economic activity across the world. Businesses failed, people lost jobs by the millions, and most importantly for Singapore, world trade fell sharply. When the world stops buying, ports stop receiving ships. When demand for tin and rubber collapsed during the Depression, the industries that had become so central to Singapore's economy were devastated. Tin prices fell. Rubber prices fell. Workers who depended on those industries lost their livelihoods. Fewer ships came to Singapore. The port economy contracted. And this is the important lesson the Great Depression taught about Singapore. Singapore depended so heavily on trade that when world trade fell, it had very little to fall back on. The same openness to the world that had driven Singapore's growth also made it vulnerable when the world's economy failed. Let me pull those three external developments together in a simple summary, because this is exactly what your external developments chart covers. The Suez Canal opened in 1869. The route between Europe and Asia became shorter. Effect: Singapore became more important as a stop for ships. Tin and rubber demand from Malaya increased as the British expanded into the peninsula. Effect: Singapore became a center for processing and exporting these commodities. The Great Depression hit in 1929. World trade fell sharply. Effect: Singapore became vulnerable because it depended so heavily on trade. The key lesson that connects all three is this: external forces could make Singapore stronger, or they could expose how dependent it was. Whether the force was a good one, like the Suez Canal, or a damaging one, like the Depression, Singapore felt the effects deeply. That is what it means to be connected to the world. Now let's step back and think about what all of this means historically. Singapore's growth from a small trading post into a major port city was not the result of just one thing. It was the result of two types of forces working together: local decisions, the free port policy, British law and order, the development of new harbor, the management of migration, created the conditions for growth. Global forces, the Suez Canal, the demand for tin and rubber, the Great Depression, shaped when and how that growth happened. These two types of forces did not work independently of each other. They interacted. The Suez Canal brought more ships to the region, but Singapore could only benefit because local decisions had made Singapore worth stopping at. The Great Depression hurt Singapore badly, but it would have hurt it less if Singapore had been less dependent on trade, and that dependence was itself the result of decades of local policy choices. Singapore's history is always a story of the local and the global together. Let me give you the exam skill you need for this topic. Many questions will ask you to explain how an external development affected Singapore. The structure for these answers is always the same. First, say what happened. Describe the event or development itself. Second, explain how it affected Singapore. This is the link, and it is the most important part. Third, state the result for Singapore. Let me show you with the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal opened in 1869 and shortened the route between Europe and Asia. This meant more ships now made the Europe to Asia journey because it was faster and cheaper. Because Singapore was located on this route, more ships stopped there, which increased trade through the port and made Singapore more important as a regional trading center. Notice that the answer does not just say the Suez Canal helped Singapore. It explains how, through the mechanism of more ships on the route, and then states the result. Apply this exact structure to tin and rubber and to the Great Depression. What happened, how it affected Singapore, what the result was. Let's close with a complete recap. British rule changed Singapore in three important ways. It created more formal governance through the Straits Settlements and then Crown Colony status. It introduced law and order and public services that made Singapore a safer and more organized place to do business. and it improved infrastructure, including the development of new harbor to handle larger ships after the Singapore River became congested. Trade grew because the free port policy continued to attract merchants, and port facilities were upgraded to keep up with demand. Migration brought diverse communities to Singapore: Chinese, Indian, Malay, European, but also caused overcrowding and poor sanitation in many areas. 3 external developments shaped Singapore from outside. The Suez Canal made Singapore more important by shortening the Europe-Asia route. Demand for tin and rubber gave Singapore a new economic role as a processing and export hub, and the Great Depression showed how vulnerable Singapore was when world trade collapsed. The historical meaning: Singapore's growth was always shaped by both local decisions and global forces working together. Before you go, here is what to do next. Complete your guided notes. 11 fill-in-the-blank sentences covering the key facts from this video. Try the practice quiz with 12 questions. Fill in your exit ticket with 4 short answers. And when you are ready to push further, try the WA-style practice questions, including the structured response question at the end, which asks how far you agree that Singapore grew because of British rule and external developments. That is a great question to practice because it pushes you to weigh both factors against each other. All of these resources, the guided notes, quiz, answer sheet, vocabulary sheet, external developments chart, port growth flow chart, trade development notes, and WA practice questions are linked in the description. If this video helped you, please like it and subscribe. Leave a comment telling me which external development you found most interesting. See you in video 5. No voiceover. YouTube end screen with soft background music at 10 to 15% volume. End screen displays links to video 3, British Trading Post, and video 5 with the subscribe button.